I'm very pleased to introduce our very distinguished speaker, Professor Martin Riesebrodt, who had spent quite a long time at the University of Chicago in the great Divinity School. Some of you who know the center well will know that Wendy Doniger, for instance, who is a staple of that department, has been for long a member of our advisory board. And I have been at the Divinity School in Chicago on a couple of occasions, and I must say, and I give you first-hand witness, it's really one of the most distinguished, demanding, rigorous institutions that deal with religion anywhere, in fact. Professor Riesebrodt has, to my mind, two particularly important works. One is entitled Pious Passion, The Emergence of Modern Fundamentalism in the United States and Iran, which combines reflection upon religion with certain reflections upon the role of religion in politics. Later on, I had the very great pleasure of reading The Promise of Salvation, A Theory of Religion. And in that particular work is very, very close to my heart. First of all, it argues against a rather fashionable view in some quarters that really religion is not a concept as such, which might be applied to a broad variety of phenomena, but that it is captive to certain moments of genesis in Europe of the 18th century, and therefore it cannot really be generalized, leading to quite a number of drifts that militate against any view of comparativism in religion, against which Professor Riesebrodt has spoken very clearly. Very clearly, of course, if we say that religion is not a concept because it was born in Europe, which, of course, in itself is a very, very contentious issue, is by no means certain, by no means established. What do we do with concepts such as the economy or society, both of which, indeed, were born in Europe as coherent concepts in the 18th century? But we do apply the ones, we don't apply the others. Why we do so, why some of us actually then argue against the broad use of a comparative notion of religion as a concept and as a phenomenon which is ubiquitous in human societies, is something which would require, which I think can be disposed of fairly quickly. Professor Riesebrodt defines religion as, and I quote, a complex of practices that are based on the premise of the existence of superhuman powers, whether personal or impersonal, that are generally invisible. To my mind, this actually does capture a phenomenon which is recurrent, empirically recurrent in all human societies, without the undue emphasis which some students of religion place upon theologies. I think in this particular case, the emphasis is upon practices, and it is really practices, to my mind, it is ritual that makes God rather than God who actually then makes ritual. I will not say anything further about what, I will not try to anticipate or even presume to anticipate what we're going to hear tonight and what is going to be said, which is going to capture all of us and cause those who are absent today to regret not having been here. Professor Riesebrodt.
Thank you so much. Professor Al-Azmeh, thank you so much for your kind words, for the kind invitation. Thank you everybody for coming. I'm happy to be here and feel extremely honored to speak to you tonight. Since many years, the concept of religion is in a state of crisis. There exist many theories of religion and even more untheorized understandings of religion that construct the object of study from diverse perspectives. And, as mentioned, there are scholars subscribing to Foucauldian discourse theory who argue that the concept of religion emerges in binary opposition to the concept of secularism in the modern West, which implies a liberal, privatized understanding of religion that cannot be used as a general analytic concept. Obviously, how religion is defined or why the concept has been rejected depends on academic disciplines, cultural and social backgrounds, religious and ideological biases, as well as other social locations that shape perspectives. Therefore, it is highly unlikely that scholars in the humanities and social sciences will ever agree on one definition of religion. In my view, this is also not necessary. But what is necessary is clarity about the differences of various understandings of religion and the analytic agendas they express. Any definition of the object implies premises, creates boundaries, and shapes a selective interest in phenomena called religious. Each perspective may also implicitly favor certain methods of studying religion, empirically, textually, or make the empirical textual study of religion difficult, if not impossible. The rejection of the concept of religion by postmodern critics has never convinced me, although I had to suffer from them for 2 decades. All the students coming out of college were in love with this idea, and therefore we had endless conversations about the futility of the concept or rejecting it. Postmodern critics tend to overlook the plurality of discourses in the modern West: political, legal, theological, scholarly, and the great variety of understandings of religion they have produced besides a liberal privatized one, since the 17th century on to the present. Deism understood religion to be the divine gift of reason. For the Romantic and phenomenological traditions, religion is a subjectivized experience of revelation, where the sacred, the holy, the eternal, or however it may be called, reveals itself, what Eliade called hierophany. Classical British evolutionist anthropology defined religion as a kind of proto-science, as an attempt at explaining the world and its wonders rationally, however with still insufficient means. For Durkheim and his school, religion represents the core of sacralized values, norms, and cognitive categories without which the coordination of society cannot function. Thomas Luckmann has transformed Durkheim's approach into a theory of religion as self-transcendence and the formation of the person. Following Robert Merritt, Bronislaw Malinowski saw the function of religion in the expression and control of affects. For Max Weber, religion develops from a quest for worldly blessings into one for eternal salvation, thereby creating various attitudes towards the world, tensions with the world, and psychological incentives for human behavior. Especially what he called salvation religions have shaped various civilizations and the deep motivational structures that inform them. In stark contrast to Weber, rational choice approaches have studied the pursuit of religious goods and services from a supply-side economic perspective on the assumption of universal stable preferences. So whereas in Weber, the preferences are created culturally, in rational choice theory, they are assumed to be universal. And last not least, critics of religion describe religion as a projection of the human into the realm of the superhuman or divine. And finally, since the 1980s, postmodern approaches have undermined all the efforts just mentioned by shedding doubt on the legitimacy of religion as a general concept. I could go on adding further approaches and confuse you even more. But the obvious point of this brief overview is that each understanding of religion creates different objects of study. So often what's called sociology of religion is actually the sociology of different things, called religious or religion, but what is religion for Durkheim is not religion for Malinowski or for Weber or for Marx. Some definitions refer to empirically observable behavior, others to certain genres of texts, and are more of concern for ideological criticism. Again, others are only accessible through introspection or techniques of questioning and interviewing. Since I find none of the perspectives fully convincing, I made things worse by proposing yet another theory of religion in my book, The Promise of Salvation, Professor Asmeh has mentioned. My discontent with conventional theories is primarily based on the fact that they often, in most theories of religion, do not focus on religion, but on effects of religion. So they don't focus on religion as an object of study, but on what religion does to civilization, politics, economics, etc. But what is religion? What does it do outside for its own purpose? Is there anything left where it's not just a substitute for something else? Furthermore, due to their definition of religion, other approaches often lack the ability to explain what we experience in the present. The coincidence of processes of secularization with the resurgence of religious movements. I don't believe that we have either secularization or the resurgence of religion. We have both at the same time, and it is interrelated. So all these debates about secularization theory, where people prove that it's going downhill or uphill, depending on the perspective, I think must be more complicated. In particular, as I mentioned, I found the postmodern critique of religion unconvincing and the dilution of the concept in functionalist sociology unproductive. As opposite as these two approaches may seem, they both manage to get rid of the concept of religion as an analytical concept, the functionalists by overgeneralizing it, the postmodern critics by over-particularizing it. By considering barbecues, football games, or art exhibition to be religious phenomena, functionalists transform anything into religion, at least somehow or implicitly, even worse. And by calling Buddhism, Hinduism, and Confucianism Western inventions, postmodern critics make the modern West, in capital letters, the inventor of everything that existed outside of the West and before the West ever entered those territories. Moreover, when football games are seen as religious phenomena and the recitation of Buddhist sutras is not, something has gone terribly wrong, I think. Let me therefore briefly address my criticism of these two approaches in particular. To limit the concept of religion to a modern Western discourse is problematic from several reasons beyond the ones I've already mentioned. First of all, the presence or absence of certain concepts is less relevant than the critics think they are. Obviously, religio is a Latin term and no one can expect to find it in Sanskrit, Chinese, or Arabic texts. Of course, there exist terms in these languages that can be and have been translated as religion, but since the concept of religion itself can carry so many diverse meanings, one can argue endlessly about the appropriateness of any translation. Second, more important than the presence or absence of a concept are the kinds of distinctions that find expression in social behavior. Instead of looking for concepts in other languages that could be translated as religion, we should look for distinctions in other societies between types of acts, actors, and institutions that would correspond with a specific understanding of religion. I believe that all known societies have distinguished social interaction processes between humans from social interactions between humans and superhuman powers. They also all have known and used specialists for the intercourse between humans and superhuman beings. Religions often have identified themselves with reference to other religions. They recognize each other, and the personnel of religions recognize each other as similar. Malinowski once reported that the inhabitants of the Polynesian island of Dobu have compared their religious practices with those of the neighboring island of Trobriand, and vice versa. Judaism has shaped itself against practices of idolatry, Christianity against Judaism and idolatry, Islam against Judaism, Christianity, and idolatry. All pre-modern empires have known religious policies for purposes of maintaining order and legitimacy, be it the Roman Empire, the Chinese dynasties of the Han, Tang, or Song, or the Muslim Mughal Empire. Moreover, there existed an early scholarly interest in religion. The Muslim scholar Muhammad ibn Ahmad al-Biruni, Gregorian calendar 973 to 1048, went to India explicitly because he knew the religions of Judaism, Christianity, Manichaeism, and Buddhism rather well, as he said, but found his knowledge of Hinduism inadequate. What did he study there? Religion was not invented yet by the West, but he went there to study something. And the famous Al-Sharastani, 1086 to 1153, wrote a noted book of sects and creeds, it's the way it's translated, in the early 12th century that contains a rather complex religious classificatory system. I have no doubt that religion in the modern West has been profoundly transformed. But to equate the transformation of Christianity with the invention of religion seems to be a grave mistake. Religions have existed before the West began secularizing, and systems of meaningful practices related to superhuman powers existed before they were named Hinduism, Buddhism, or Taoism, or Shinto, or whatnot. The practices were there already. The name changed, but you cannot argue that a phenomenon starts existing once you have a new name for it. This needs more in-depth analysis, I think. Let me turn to my critique of functionalist understandings of religion, which are more entertaining, I think, than the other ones. Every January, after having read Emil Durkheim's Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, college students in the social sciences in the United States are asked to write a paper analyzing the Super Bowl, which is the championship game in American football, as a religious event. In their papers, they usually point out the presence of key symbols of civil religion, the flag, the national anthem, the stereotypes of heroic men in uniforms, and cheerleading women in silly outfits, the effervescence created by eager anticipation of the event, media hype, artificially created noise, and musical performances by celebrities doing halftime, and so on. Even the commercials are eagerly anticipated because all the advertisers try to do their best for that event because you have like 50 million viewers or so. Exactly like Durkheim's example taken from the Australian Inti Chuma writes, religion represents secularized society where in a situation of effervescence, societal key symbols and moral principles are publicly presented and reinforced. This tribal model expresses what religion is all about, at least for second-hand readers of Durkheim. At the same time, these papers will omit all features that are part of the Super Bowl, but absent from any religious event I've ever witnessed or read about. For example, whereas religious events are usually free of charge, people have to pay a lot of money for Super Bowl tickets, in the black market up to $2,000 and more. Who would pay that for a religious event? The game is being played with a winner and a loser. Referees permanently monitor and interrupt the game, and there are video analyses of plays, fouls, and scores. There are additional breaks when commercials are broadcasted for the TV audience. During the game, people cheer and boo and consume enormous amounts of Coke, beer, and sausages. Whenever something gets exciting on the field, they leave to the bathrooms. Afterwards, the coach of the winning team becomes a national or at least a local hero. Without denying that there exist some similarities between the Super Bowl and some religious events, to be determined, these analogies seem utterly selective and superficial. Much of what is going on in religious event has no analogy in football and vice versa. Religion and football are very different games, played according to very different rules, aiming at very different outcomes. Moreover, these analogies are based on wrong logical attributions. The fact that religious rituals and sports events exhibit certain similarities does not make sports events religious phenomena. The common denominator is not religion, but ritual. For Thomas Luckmann, religion in the modern world has become invisible, subjectivized, and deinstitutionalized. For him, religion is identical with self-transcendence, and as such, it is necessary for personhood and identity formation. Instead of distinguishing between religious and other forms of self-transcendence, his definition makes religion universal, ubiquitous, and empty. Do we really want to study chess players and stamp collectors, marathon runners, and nudists under the rubric of religion? Does it make sense? Does it explain the resurgence of religion? Do we have more nudists than before, or what are we referring to? Religion as Super Bowl tells us nothing about the event that it claims to analyze. One can read hundreds of essays and still doesn't know how the game of football is actually played. There's nothing about how it's played. No rules, no action, nothing. This is typical for functionalist explanations, which confuse an explanation of social phenomena with its supposed effects on society, usually without even verifying such effects empirically. Therefore, let me offer you an alternative perspective on religion that is, I think, generally applicable, is based on a substantive definition of the object, and understands religion not as theology, but as meaningful practices. Here's my definition, which is quite close to an earlier one by Melford Spiro, a wonderful scholar who somehow ran out of fashion because he was ahead of his times, but I think he was splendid. Religions are systems of meaningful practices with reference to personal or impersonal superhuman powers. That is, powers that are believed to be capable of influencing or controlling dimensions of the practitioners' lives, the practitioners themselves regard as being beyond human control. As Freud already pointed out, these dimensions beyond human control are generally related to the mortality of the human body, illness, old age, death, the lack of control over natural forces, tsunamis, earthquakes, and the like, and the precariousness of social relations, inscribed, for example, in social inequality, changes in social status, and social conflicts. What are such meaningful religious practices? For practical purposes, I offer a typology and distinguish between three types of religious practices: discursive, regulatory, and interventive. I explain what this means. The concept of discursive practices refers to communications between social actors about superhuman powers and their significance. This is a realm of theology broadly understood. So if there's a thunderstorm and one house in the village burns down, people wonder why it hit their village and why the house of their neighbor, who is supposed to be quite pious. The concept of regulatory practices refers to behavior geared to the will or known reactions of superhuman powers like divine commandments, moral rules, or taboos. The concept of interventive practices refers to culturally imagined ways of communicating with superhuman powers or manipulating them, like in prayer, sacrifices, or magical acts. If these powers are believed to reside in the human body, mind, heart, soul, or spirit, also their internal activation is a case of interventive practices. So for certain virtuosi practices, I've added it in order also to not exclude non-theistic religions. This definition of religion and typology of practices can hardly be accused of being particularly Eurocentric, I assume. It is not modeled after a specific religion, especially not after Christianity, even in its terminology, but rather after a concept like kinship. Kinship refers to structures of social relations based on beliefs in common descent and marriage. Religion refers to structures of social relations between humans and superhuman powers believed to being able to influence, etc. So basically, it is a structural relationship which exists in various forms in all societies I'm knowledgeable of. Of course, these are not all, but if you find one which doesn't know it, let me know. It's also a concept which is empirically accessible. Either those beliefs in those relationships exist or they don't. So I'm not claiming that it's a necessity for any society to have those relationships. I simply claim that empirically, I assume it is universal, or at least widespread. This definition does not privilege any specific religion, nor does it make claims about its public or private character. It is culturally quite unspecific and therefore can be generally applied. The system of meaningful practices related to human powers, my definition calls religion, are much narrower than the broad notion of religion in our everyday language. And that's important to emphasize because it could lead to misunderstandings, which in our everyday language, I think what we call religion, I would prefer to call religious traditions. Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism contain and contribute to often quite diverse systems of practices across space and time. So there are sort of the resource or the resources out of which concrete religious system practices in time and space emerge. but it contains so much more than what I define as religion as a system of practices, that one has to acknowledge the difference, however you like or don't like the change in terminology I'm proposing here. They refer to broader religious and often also cultural traditions. Scholars may use them in order to draw religious maps over long periods of time based on key symbols. Authorities may use them in order to create internal cohesion and external difference. And ordinary people refer to them in order to emphasize broad cultural features that distinguish ways of life and historical experiences. Religion should also be distinguished from religiosity as a subjective appropriation and interpretation of a religion or segments of various religions. Not every religious person belongs to a religion in terms of a system of practices. But the concept of religion I'm proposing is not one which has to necessarily stick to one tradition. It can be syncretistic, popular, whatever. So I'm not, there's no dogmatic or theological element in my definition of religion. Whatever there is as a system of practices is a religion. To approach religion focusing on practices as meaningful actions has advantages, I hope. Otherwise it would be quite futile. For example, it allows us to overcome the insider-outsider divide. One of the perennial problems of theories of religion has been the discrepancy between scholarly explanations and the self-perception of religious actors, or between outsiders and insiders. Scholars of religion themselves disagree upon the point. Scholars in the romantic or phenomenological tradition have always claimed to represent the insider perspective, whereas social scientists have often ignored the insider perspective as irrelevant or ideological. Both positions have problems. Social scientists have not always been successful in explaining the superiority and objectivity of their own position, whereas phenomenologists have failed to establish their privileged insider position. It is actually not so easy to determine who an insider is or who is a representative of insiders. Theologians, religious authorities, virtuosi, or lay practitioners. In order to identify an insider perspective that is not arbitrarily chosen and to concentrate on what is most specific to religion, I propose two strategic moves. And these moves I do because I want to build up a theory of religion based on self-representations of religions, so that they find themselves in an abstracted form in what I say about them. So that it's not the objective social scientist who then says what it really is, but rather that I try to build up an understanding of it and include it in my theory of religion, so that there is a field where you can communicate across the board. So the two strategic moves are to focus on interventive practices, that is, believed interactions between humans and superhuman powers, and second, to look for their meaning in liturgies. Why focus on interventive instead of discursive or regulatory practices? As I already mentioned, these three types of practices are closely related, overlap, etc. So these are analytic distinctions which are sometimes borderline. Nevertheless, I think interventive practices represent the logical precondition of the other types of practices. This does not imply that they precede the others historically or genetically, but without a belief in the existence of superhuman powers and the possibility of communicating with them, discursive and regulatory practices have no foundation. If they are not accessible, they cannot tell us how to behave. Second, interventive practices represent a clearly differentiated sphere of culturally believed social interaction processes, which corresponds with the self-understanding of religious actors across time and cultures. So the old question, do those powers really exist, is sociologically irrelevant as long as they exist for the practitioners, as they are relevant for the interpretation of social behavior. The emphasis shifts the study of religion from theology and ethics to worship, but theology and ethics, which are generally discursive practices of intellectuals removed from worship practices, re-enter the analysis through the analysis of worship practices, because ethical questions and theological questions, of course, are embedded in worship practices. But those theologies and ethics are known and communicated to the lay practitioners. So they are much more widely known and not simply in the realm of intellectuals. The focus on interventive practices recenters the study of religion away from intellectual religious elites to the laity and ritual specialists. But how do we know the meanings religious interventive practices really carry? As far as I can see, we have three potential sources: discourses of intellectuals, subjective interpretations of practitioners, and liturgies. Intellectual discourses certainly are immensely important sources for the interpretation of religions, but they are rather detached from the meanings interventive practices carry. They often express a certain distance or even contempt vis-à-vis lay practices. Moreover, intellectual discourses tend to be rather heterogeneous and unable to agree on the meaning of religious practices. They argue all the time. So to look for a consensus among theologians or intellectuals is futile. So the second option would be to ask the practitioners. But this option leads to an even greater instability and lack of systematicity than the study of intellectual discourses. Lay practitioners are often poorly equipped to respond to questions about things they simply take for granted. These are not objects of reflection, these are things they take for granted. That is how the world is and what we do in the world. So if they are able to answer, they often give ad hoc interpretations depending on the situation. And the interpretations of different lay practitioners may vary dramatically according to class, gender, age, or other demographic factors. Whereas subjectivist interpretations are of great importance for the ethnographic study of religious communities, so it's not an area one shouldn't study, they just are not good sources for theorizing religion via the meanings those practices carry. But what now is the alternative to these two sources? It is a study of liturgies, which I define rather broadly as scripts for the intercourse between humans and superhuman powers. These scripts, understood here in the sense the sociologist Erwin Goffman used it, not very precisely either, contain the roles humans and superhumans are supposed to play in their encounter. They contain the rules of interaction based on the promises and expectations that inform such performances. These scripts do not have to be codified in writing, but can exist as oral traditions. They can be accessible only to the priestly classes or opened to all, because even if the scripts are secret knowledge, as for example in many Taoist practices, the pragmatic effects of the performances tend to be widely known. outside at the temple, you can read what it's about, what's happening inside. And similar things take place at the home altar in the family, so they are familiar with it. Liturgies, described as scripts, are authoritative and objective. No matter what individuals personally believe, when they perform or participate in worship practices, they follow such scripts. Even dissenters submit to the theology inscribed in liturgies. They might sit there angry, but they sit there and don't respond. So the power of the liturgy, the script, forces itself on everybody who participates and doesn't leave. No insider perspective, therefore, is more steady, reliable, powerful, and empirically accessible than the liturgical one. And that also applies to historic research, because if you want to build up a theory of religion, you need the same kinds of sources across time. You cannot have opinion polls for the modern era and some texts for the medieval age, and then some ruins for early antiquity. You have to have relatively stable sources in order to make general claims. So the accessibility is important as well. If religion is defined as a system of practices related to superhuman powers, and the meaning of such practices can be found in scripts or liturgies, where does this lead us? In order to find out, I, a couple of years ago, analyzed religious practices related to religious calendars, recurrent holidays and their meaning, to the life cycle, what happens at different stages in the lives of people from birth to death, and responses to unexpected events. So what happens if something unexpected happens, which is unexpected but not unexpected because there's already a script what you do when it happens. And I looked at 6 religious traditions, of course, spottily and selectively. I looked at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Chinese and Japanese Buddhism, Taoism, and Shinto. In order not to bore you to tears, let me briefly summarize what the scripts for these practices reveal on their lowest common denominator. They reveal that religions promise, across history and religious traditions, to avert misfortune, help people coping with crises, and bring temporal blessings or even eternal salvation. Moreover, as I mentioned earlier, what counts as crisis is related to the mortality of the human body, a lack of control over nature, and the precariousness of social relations. Obviously, religious practices across times and traditions share a rather pragmatic core. Of course, you might say, so what? This is rather boring and unsurprising. We knew that already. Well, if you knew it already, why didn't you use it in order to understand, explain religion? If there is indeed a universally shared common core across religious traditions, we might have found an excellent starting point for theoretical and comparative purposes. Of course, these shared features of religions do not prove, and were not intended to prove, that all religions are basically the same. That conclusion would indeed be boring. Quite to the contrary, the identification of a common core is valuable exactly because it allows for meaningful comparisons. Instead of repeating the empty postmodern mantra of the supposed uniqueness of all phenomena, religious and cultural, comparisons now have a reference point that helps us, giving particularities a profile that is actually meaningful and interesting. Moreover, this identification of a common core, shared by all religions, supposedly, is not an attempt at identifying an essence. What is essential to religion in my theory is obviously an effect of the chosen perspective that creates religion as an object of study. Other perspectives will lead to other understandings of religion and emphases of what might be central to them. So it's not that I thought, well, now I've found what religion is really all about. You know, this is not what the intention is, but rather that we have, instead of starting how diverse religions are and how little they have in common, we start with how much they have in common, and then how do they interpret what they have in common in various interesting particular ways. What my theory offers is a focus on religious practices instead of theologies, on actors and institutions instead of functions, on the laity and ritual specialist instead of religious intellectuals, on a universally shared pragmatic core of religions instead of their particularistic features. The theory of religion I'm proposing is not only an intellectual exercise, but also wants to suggest certain ways of asking and pursuing research questions. I have criticized functionalist theories for deducing their interpretation of religion from societal requirements. Conversely, my theory of religion is designed to read religion and religious practices as seismograph of the social. If religious practices are meant to avert misfortune, to help people coping with crisis, and to promote temporal blessings or even eternal salvation, then religious practices, carefully studied, inform us about the misfortune to be averted, the crisis in need of coping with, the temporal blessings hoped for, and the imagined eternal happiness. But how would one proceed? Of course, the strategy to establish a theoretical perspective is very different from working with that perspective empirically. For the purpose of theorizing, it was sufficient to analyze liturgies or institutionalized scripts. For it is reasonable to assume that such scripts regulating the intercourse between humans and superhuman powers and mediating between promises and expectations contain some of the most basic claims religions raise. And if the scripts of various religions across cultural and historical boundaries make very similar promises, it is again reasonable to define those as a starting point from where one begins analyzing religion. However, when we analyze lived religions, we cannot limit ourselves to an analysis of orally or textually transmitted scripts. We have to study scripts in action. Now attention has to be paid to the staging of the same script in concrete performances, including their intentional and unintentional deviations. Each performance has its unique features. Each situation may change how scripts are staged and impact the practitioners. Let me give you two examples which came to mind when I wrote the paper. There is a famous debate among anthropologists about the Nkwala, a first fruit festival among the Swazi in East Africa. Hilda Küper, Max Gluckman, Steve Beidelman, and the Apter and others have offered various interpretations based on Küper's original description. But it was Bruce Lincoln whose intervention added a new dimension to the debate when he proved from the text, the original text where nobody had paid attention, that the performance reported by Küper was heavily influenced by the presence of high-ranking British colonial officers. So it was not the typical ritual of the Bantu, it was a very particular performance in a very particular situation. Another example. On Ashura, the 10th day of the month of Muharram, Shiite Muslims commemorate in their theology the martyrdom of Imam Hussein during the battle against the oppressor Yazid at Karbala that took place in 680 according to the Gregorian calendar. The Taziyeh is a passion play about this martyrdom enacted mostly in Iran and has been performed there for some centuries. But during the political confrontations in the 1970s that led to the revolution, it was instantaneously reinterpreted as a battle of the followers of Khomeini against the oppressive Shah of Iran. These two examples demonstrate that ritual performances always want to give the impression that they are eternal and unchanging, but in fact, they are regularly renewed through the situation in which they are performed. Occasionally, scripts may or may not be reinterpreted, but also even rewritten, intentionally. Therefore, what I call script should not be identified with unchangeable dogmatic impositions by religious authorities. Any religious community has its scripts and its traditions of staging it, but they all will reinterpret them and make them speak to new situations. This focus on interventive practices and their scripts allows scholars to study communal practices of congregations, clans, tribes, or nations in a Durkheimian fashion, but it also can be used to analyze practices of various classes, groups, and categories of people that vary according to age, gender, or ethnicity, for example. This approach could be useful for the study of religious immigrant communities. In addition to other methods, it might be enlightening to analyze their self-articulation in liturgies, sermons, and prayers, where they express in their own language how they experience the world they inhabit as immigrants, what kinds of misfortunes they fear, what crises they try to cope with, and what blessings they hope for, instead of asking silly questions in opinion polls with no relation to their life experience. Also, overcoming romantic notions of immigrant communities, one can also further differentiate, of course. The young and the old, women and men, the uneducated and the educated classes will be exposed to rather different kinds of misfortunes and crises and will express different ideas of what temporal blessings or eternal happiness means. It is these kinds of questions and research agendas my theory hopes to stimulate and support. But isn't the theory of religion rather old-fashioned and outdated? Does it sort of reflect on a religion which is long gone? I don't think so, but maybe it is. It certainly does not follow certain contemporary trends. First, it defends religion as a general analytic concept. Second, it takes the self-representations of religion seriously in order to understand the logic of religious practices. And third, it resists the trend to dissolve religion into spirituality, whatever that may be. My sort of tongue-in-cheek definition is that this is what professors find when they study their own students or so. Let me briefly comment on the last point. Many sociologists of religion claim that spirituality has established itself as a dominant form of religion in the 21st century. I have serious doubts about it. Based on my definition, spirituality is not identical with religion, so it doesn't qualify, not in a value-laden sense. It is different. I have defined religion as a system of practices with reference to superhuman powers. This implies that there exist not just beliefs of some sort, but practices that express such beliefs. Such beliefs and practices need a certain systematicity and social affirmation in order to achieve stability and plausibility. A hodgepodge of unrelated ideas cannot support a system of practices, at least not over long times. And a hodgepodge of practices that lacks social affirmation lacks basic characteristics of a religion. However, a hodgepodge of ideas and practices can become a religion after it has been institutionalized, systematized, and socially shared. So there's nothing, not because it might be new or it might be heterodox, that's not the reason why I'm sort of find spirituality being structurally different from religion, but because of a lack of stability and institutionalization. I'm not arguing that people who hold individualized idiosyncratic beliefs might not be called religious or spiritual. There's religiosity outside of religion, and if this represents a mass phenomenon, it is certainly worth studying from a sociological point of view. But if the promises of averting misfortune, coping with crisis, and providing blessings and eternal salvation are indeed central to religions, then religious associations that make such promises with conviction will remain vital. Old associations will survive and new ones will emerge. Of course, if gods or saviors would suddenly descend from heaven and create paradise on earth, religions and their mediators might be out of business. But this is a rather unlikely scenario. Thank you very much.